Over the past century or so, there has been two competing views about sex and sexuality, which have raged at each other in the hopes of winning the acquiescence of the people through research, although I would use research in air quotes, editorials, sermons, and even political legislation. They can basically be summarized like this. One view says that sex, like everything else, brings with it an intrinsic moral dimension, which means that sex can be partaken in conformity to what is good and true and beautiful, or in rebellion against it in the form of evil or perversion. According to this view, because sex requires moral consideration, we as moral agents must govern our appetites and our behaviors accordingly. This means that whatever we do, we have to do what is good and right. We have to make good and right choices, and we can call this the traditional view. According to the other view, there is no intrinsic moral dimension to sex, or if there is, it's far less significant and pronounced than the traditional view would have us believe. Instead, sex is just like any other leisure activity that we could participate in. And it's unreasonable to expect people to moderate their sexual behavior, because that will just exacerbate their appetites, and that's unrealistic anyways. This view encourages us to explore and to liberate our sexuality in the hopes of tasting all the fruits and experiences that it has to offer. And in order to ensure that we can engage in as much sexual experience as possible, we've developed technology to mitigate the potential negative consequences. And this position we can call the liberal position. And we often see these two views clash in a more pronounced way whenever there's a health emergency or an outbreak of sexually transmitted diseases. The traditional view, or the advocates of the traditional view, will say something like, if people would just stick with one sexual partner throughout their whole life, these kinds of consequences would never occur. And that's true. But the liberal contingency will say that that's far too lofty a solution and it will never work. So the best we can hope for is to continue to rely on technology, and perhaps improved technology, to mitigate these kinds of negative consequences. Well, I think that there are ways that we can demonstrate that sex has profound moral considerations, and that how we engage in it will have profound moral consequences. And unlike the liberal advocates, I don't think that sex is just like any other leisure activity that we might want to compare it to. And there are a lot of ways that I think we could demonstrate this, but I want to focus in on one, which is the fact that forcing or pressuring someone to perform a sexual act is universally considered morally reprehensible. This is something that both the liberal and the traditional positions can agree upon. But for those that would say that sex is just like any other leisure activity, that brings with it a glaring contradiction. For example, if a song was being played in a public place and I was pressured into dancing to that song with somebody else, which is something that I have experienced in my own life, my introverted, melancholic self might resent that experience to some degree, but I wouldn't be severely traumatized by that experience. Like if I was at a dance club with a group of friends of mine and their favorite dance song came on and they all got up and started dancing, and I was reluctant to because I hate dance club music, but they all insisted that I join in because it's their favorite song, well, that would be considered fairly normal social behavior. Now, why is that? If sex is just like any other thing that we can decide to do or not to do with no real moral considerations or consequences, why the complete disparity between other things that we think of as inconsequential leisure options and sex when it comes to being pressured or forced to do it? Again, I can think of countless times my friends pressured me or even, forced me to do some leisure activity that I didn't want to do, like maybe getting outvoted on the movie we were going to go see or the restaurant we were going to. In fact, I can even think of several times my wife pressured me to go camping when I didn't want to. In fact, this is even a systemic phenomenon, because I can think of several times when I was pressured into doing something in gym class that I didn't want to do. The reason sex is so different is because it is so profoundly morally consequential. Making good sexual decisions will produce profoundly good moral outcomes. Making bad sexual decisions will produce very negative moral consequences. This is why when we have sexual experiences, our conscience is on such high alert, and it's harder to not be attentive to our conscience. We will have experiences and emotions related to love, pleasure, intimacy, fulfillment, or guilt, bitterness, shame, enmity, all depending on whether or not we make good or bad moral decisions. Every fiber of our being compels us to participate in that moral agency when it comes to sex, which is why having that agency stripped from you is so traumatically violating. So what is it about sex that makes it so morally heightened? Well, sex is an expression of intimacy. Just like your words are an expression or a material expression of your thoughts, sex is a material, physical expression of the intimacy that you have another person. It's an expression of love that is supposed to be in place. But sex with somebody that you don't love or you don't have intimacy with is a contradiction of that expression. It's an attempt to produce a material expression of something that does not exist. Therefore, it is a lie, and that dishonesty partaken with your body in this fullest capacity of sexuality is a profoundly moral thing to do. I think this helps to explain why so many people rely on alcohol or drugs to suppress their moral conscience before they head on a night of potential sexual promiscuity. If alcohol or drugs weren't a factor, imagine what a reduction there would be in occasions of things like one-night stands and the morning after walk of shame where you have sobered up and you can now hear your moral conscience again. Now, what is essential to any good philosophy, including moral philosophy, is that it's consistent with itself. If it contradicts itself in any way, that's a pretty good indication that it's flawed in at least one essential ingredient. Now, I've already identified what I think is a glaring contradiction in the liberal position on sex, but I want to point out just one more, and then I think we'll leave it there. Sex is an intrinsic element within marriage. It's what distinguishes marriage in one way, from most other kinds of relationships. And the government and society take a legal interest in marriage. And the reason that they do so is because some people within certain kinds of sexual relationships, that is marriages, are signaling to society that they may start to raise offspring. They may raise new citizens within that relationship. And the government, as well as society in general, should want to encourage fidelity within that relationship, that marriage, for the sake of those children and the good of society. Now, that conviction has waned somewhat over the past century or so, but anybody who takes an honest look at the research on this knows that the outcomes for children and their development are far, far better in a scenario where they are raised by a mother and a father who stay together and are faithful in that marriage. Such children are more likely to perform well in school, get good jobs, avoid committing crimes, and are less likely to be afflicted by certain mental health disorders. All of which is to say that fidelity in marriage is really important for the common good of society, which is why society expects us to govern our sexual passions when we are married. This is a principle that is recognized by advocates of both the traditional and the liberal positions. But all the way up until the point when a person says, I do, confessing their commitment to a marriage, they are marinated in a culture and an education system that is dominated by the liberal position, which insists that it is futile to try to govern your sexual passions and that chastity education, it just doesn't work. Which is why, according to that position, the best we can hope for is that people will be willing to mutilate the healthy function of their reproductive system through pharmaceutical agents, or they will be willing to wrap their organs in single-use, non-disposable latex packaged in single-use, non-disposable plastics. But you'd be missing the contradiction if all you took away from that was that the ocean is now full of used condoms. The contradiction is that while you are young and impressionable, you are told that it's impossible to govern your sexual appetite, so you might as well just follow your appetite. But then while you are still young, you should commit yourself to a lifestyle in which you must strictly govern your sexual appetite for the good of society in the form of a marriage relationship. We cannot advance those two things. We can't tell people that they must govern their passions for the sake of themselves, their offspring, their spouse, and the good of society, but also tell them that it's impossible to govern their passions, so they might as well just be promiscuous. Either it is possible to govern our sexual passions, and we should start training young people from an early age about that, or it's not, and we should stop pretending like fidelity within marriage is attainable, even though countless generations before us have already proven that it is. Thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you feel called to support this work, then consider joining the Reinforcements, which is my online community. There are multiple tiers, including free access for those who can't help financially but still want to join. You can join up at www.brianholdsworth.ca. Certain levels will also get a free gift basket from Glory and Shine, who is a family-owned Catholic bath and body products company whose beard balm I'm wearing right now. It's like aromatherapy for your face. Even if you don't join, they make amazing products, so check them out at gloryandshine.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe. You don't have to agree with everything I said to get value out of these kinds of conversations, so be sure to subscribe to be edified or challenged. There's value in both.